Okay, now that we know how to construct the frequency distribution table and we know all the terminologies, absolute frequency, cumulative, stuff like that, now let's see how does our table look like when we present it graphically. And we're going to talk about three main charts: histogram, frequency polygon, and a cumulative frequency graph. So first, let's look at the histogram. And histogram is just your simple bar chart, which once you're done with your table, you can easily draw it in Excel. That's what I've done. Now, the good thing about the histogram or any chart actually is that with a glance, you can just tell which interval has, like the most number of observations in it, which one has the least. Again, we know about the table here, but even if we didn't have the table, we could just look at this chart and see, all right, these two intervals, they have the most number of observations, which is 4. And this one has the least number of observations, this interval, which is only 1, right? So that's a good way of presenting data that you can quickly come up to conclusions and find out what you're looking for, right? Okay, now, sometimes you might see like another interval down here, but no bar on top of it. That would mean that that interval is empty, right? There is no observations in it. Okay, so let's move on to the frequency polygon. And let me do something here. If this is the middle of this interval, this is the middle of this one, and this. Let me connect these lines. Okay. Now this is like a cleaner version of what I've done here, right? So frequency polygon just connects the middle points of each interval together and creates like a smoother line, so you can have a better idea of how the data is distributed, and that becomes very important later on, how the data is distributed. So that's how we can read frequency polygon, right? And again, in Excel, you can, if once you have drawn your histogram, there are some functions that you can just add a line frequency polygon on top of it, and you can do a lot with Excel. Anyway, now we can talk about cumulative relative frequency chart, which is this column right here. And as you can see, the line is ever increasing, right? Because what we are doing with the cumulative relative frequency, if you can remember, we were just adding the percentages, right? So it's going up continuously until it gets to 100%, right? This doesn't mean anything. So until it gets to 100%, it doesn't matter if you have a million interval or 2 interval. Anyway, the last interval should get to the 100%. That is your 100% of your data, right? Now, one important thing about cumulative distribution is the slope of the line. That can help me in finding out where my big intervals are. The slope of the line at any interval is proportional to the number of observations in that interval. So when you see the line is pretty steep and it's rising, fast, that means that's where your big intervals are. And here I can clearly see that this is where the line is picking up, right? So that means my second and third interval, they are the bigger intervals, right? And I know that from the table. It's also obvious that these two, they have the most number of observations, right? And when the line flattens out here, that means that we have the least number of observations. The slope kind of comes down, and it's not rising that fast, right? And they're all verifiable, but just looking at the table, right? So, but these are the things that to keep in mind. Even if you do not have the table, these are the information that you can get from the chart alone. Okay, let's do one example to sort of put everything together. So the question is, have equities rewarded investors in different countries in the long run? And the countries we're examining are going to be the 19 major countries: Australia, Belgium, Canada, all the way through United States. And this column over here, the arithmetic mean, means the average return, the average asset returns in each country. And when I say average, we are talking about from 1900 through 2010. So January 1900 through December 2010. That means 111 years in total. I think we all know how to do an average. So it's just, summing all the annual returns for these 111 years, then divide by the total number of returns, which is again 111 years. And we are talking about real equity returns, by the way. That means they're inflation adjusted. Now, to answer the question, let's construct a frequency distribution table. Now, the first step would be to come up with the range, right? Range of our data. So our range, let's look for our highest return, 9.5%, our lowest return, 5.1%. Now, if you can recall, I said when we are dealing with numbers like that, we can just round them, right? We don't have to use that. So instead of 9.5, maybe I can write 10%, and instead of 5.1, I can write 5, right? I would still include both of these in this range. So 10 minus 5, my range would be 5%. Now we have to decide how many different ways do we want to split that 5%. So how many intervals do we want to have? And since we have 5% range, well, it's reasonable to have 5 1% intervals, right? So the width of my intervals are going to be 5 divided by 5. That gives me 1% width for my intervals. So my first interval is going to be like 5 to 6, then 6 to 7, and it goes on, right? This is the complete table. Now, as you can see, we have our intervals. We have 5 intervals, and each interval has a width of 1%, right? Now, the first thing that we can notice by just looking at the absolute frequency column is that this interval, 7 to 8%, has the most number of observations in it. 5 returns are in here. The rest are just 3 and 4, right? And that 5 returns that are in here, that means there more than a quarter of all the observations are in here, right? And this is something that we can find out from the relative frequency. And if you can recall how we find out about the relative frequency, total number of observations are 19, and then 5 divided by 19, right? Okay, so more than a quarter of the returns are in the 7 to 8% interval. So that's the first thing that we can notice here. All right, now what else can I say about this table? I can also say that, following this same interval, the cumulative relative frequency of this interval is also 63.16. Now, what does that mean? That means, well, 63.16% of the returns are less than 8%, yeah, but not less than 5. So 63.16% of all the returns are from somewhere between 5 to 8%, but less than 8%. If 63.16% are less than 8%, that means 36.84% of them are more than 8%. From 8 to 10, right? That'll be the difference between 63.16 and 100%. Or you could have just looked at this column. That'll be these two the result of summing up these two numbers. That'll be 36.84, right? So about 37% of the observations of the returns are more than 8%, 8 to 10%, and 63.16% of them are less than 8%, between 5 and 8%. So, have equities rewarded investors in different countries in the long run? Well, yeah, because the worst return that they could get was 5.1, and the best 9.5. And keep in mind, these are inflation adjusted, so the actual returns could be a bit higher because we are adjusting it for inflation. That means we are deducting that inflation from it. So let's say on average countries, because these are developed countries, on average if they had an inflation between 2 to 5%, so we are deducting that from the actual return. So overall, well, not too bad. Okay, now let's have a graphical representation of our table. Now, looking at the histogram, it is very obvious that this bar in our 7 to 8% interval has the most number of observations, 5. And looking at the frequency polygon also, we can see where it peaked at 5, 7 to 8% interval. Cumulative relative frequency, if you can recall, we were concerned about the slope of the line, but since here the returns in each interval, it's very close to each other, so it's quite difficult to detect the slope of the line when it changes. But if you can look closely, that should be here, 7 to 8% range, and that tells me this is where most of the returns lie. Now, another thing I can find out with the cumulative relative frequency chart is that, let me try to draw a line over here, then we go all the way here. If I can recall correctly from the table, it was 63.16% line, right? So I can say that 63.16% of the returns are less than 8%. And since that's the case, that means 36.84% of the returns are more than 8%. Now, still keep in mind we are working with a limited amount of data. So, imagine if you have a lot of data, working with a chart like that, getting informations like that on a chart, that would be very useful. And you will see what I mean, because in the next few slides, we are going to analyze the monthly returns on the S&P 500, and there we can use all the knowledge that we have here.